Okay, good evening everybody. I hope my voice is audible to everybody. If there is any issue, just let me know. Am I audible to everybody? Can you just let me know? Either through the chat box or you can unmute yourself in that. Hello. Okay, I hope I'm audible to everybody. Okay, with no certain delay, let us begin with today's session, the week number 7, Housing Policy and Planning Problem Solving session for the NPTEL course in 0 NOC 22C52. The NPTEL course by Professor Uttam Kumar Roy of IIT Roorkee. I am Aditya Bandari. I am Prime Minister Research Fellow at IIT Roorkee. So let us go through the today's session. First of all, we will today's agenda is we will try to discuss certain problems associated with the sessions that have happened in the week number 7. So for this session, we have 4 questions from the previous year's questions. We'll try to answer them and we'll try to observe the 4 different options which are available for each and every question. We'll try to solve them. And further, for today's session, one of the interesting things which we are trying to discuss is there are different documents which we have referred for the urban villages, the concept of urban villages and how the housing much varies, and what are the different concepts and factors associated with the uh, urban villages and what are the problems faced by the residents of urban villages in Indian cities. And there was one case study of the National Capital Territory of Delhi. So we will discuss it accordingly. The National Capital Territory of Delhi, the report was prepared by the World Research Institute WRI in 2020. So it was an interesting case study which can be helpful for us to understand the urban villages and what goes on, what are the dynamics of population growth and the urban planning that happens, housing development that happens in these urban villages. Okay. So with no delay, let us go and check the first question today. The first question is, which of the following is not an informal housing typology? So basically, if you remember the informal housing typology, it usually consists of illegal settlements, the settlements which include the squatters, the settlements which include the slums, the settlements which include the unauthorized colonies, unauthorized construction. So informal housing typology is basically it represents the type of households that do not have tenancy, the proper land holding rights. So informal housing typology. So it consists of different plugins as we discussed, slums, squatters, and unauthorized colonies fall into this informal housing typology. So let us look at each and every option here again. Employer housing, it actually comes into the uh, formal housing typology. So it is the correct option for this particular answer. But let us also examine other options which we have in this particular question. The second one is Juggi Jopudi. It is a type of informal housing typology which is much prevalent in the North Indian states and North Indian Union territories. So the third one is refugee settlements. Refugee settlements, as we discussed in the previous session, as discussed by Professor also. These are basically the type of settlements which actually are inhabited by the people who came as refugees from different parts. Maybe when the maybe due to the bifurcation of the country into different parts, or maybe the refugees from different countries, refugees from one state to another, refugees can happen from any part of the country. So the settlements are where the people who have left certain place because of some or other kind of exodus, they come and settle in a different society, different city. Such settlements are refugee settlements. So this is also usually an informal housing type also. The third one is urban villages. Again, the urban villages, as discussed in the previous sessions, urban villages usually consist of the villages which have been encompassed and surrounded by the latent urban development that happened over a period of time. For example, if you look at different cities, usually uh, a city might consist of multiple pockets which is also surrounded by several villages in the outskirts. However, over a period of time, as the city grows, these villages get encompassed by the urban activity, and the urban activity actually impacts uh, the rural activity that is happening within the villages. So slowly there will be a transformation from this village into a semi-urban and further completely into an urban area. So these are the urban villages. That is how the urban villages form. So if you look at this particular question, the correct answer is, as we discussed, employer housing. Employer housing basically comes in the formal housing typology. Employer housing is, as we discussed in the previous lesson, employer housing is usually uh, uh, it comes under the category of institutional housing. Institutional housing where the employer tries to provide some kind of residences to the employees of his or her particular firm or company or maybe the society or anything. So whenever these people reside in this kind of institutional houses, it forms a formal housing typology. So the question is asking us to identify the typology which is not informal. That is, we have to identify which is either formal or organic. So employer housing is actually a formal housing typology. It is the correct answer for this question. Jhuggi Jhopadi, refugee settlements and urban villages are actually the examples of the informal housing typologies. So the correct answer for this question, the first question today, is employer housing. So let us go to the second question. So untenable slums are slums on dash sites. So the untenable slums, which if we discuss the sessions which we have attended this week, so there is the concept of tenability for the each and every pocket of land which is there in the urban area. So these sites can have different properties. Some of the times they are vulnerable to certain kind of activities. Maybe maybe if a settlement is close to the if a settlement is close to the site of waste disposal, solid waste disposal, it could have some kind of health hazards, health related impacts. If a settlement is located close to the canals or the rivers which are prone to flooding in the during the period of high heavy rains or with heavy downpour, such periods, these are vulnerable to the flooding and other associated health hazards also. It is some kind of vulnerability is caused by this kind of land property because of their location, the proximity and the surrounding land uses and everything. So untenable slums are basically uh, the land located on the lands which are having some kind of vulnerability to some of the hazardous activities. So, for example, so there are four options given here. So the first one is develop hazardous public and forest. So, if you look at this particular option, the first one is the developed sites. So, the developed sites refer to the highly developed. There is high build density and high population density already existing in that particular site. So, if a slum is located on a developed site, it is actually not untenable definitely, because the property of the site in terms of development does not actually define the vulnerability or hazardous nature of that particular land site in the urban area. So the correct answer for this one will be hazardous, and the public sites it also again. So basically, whenever we are looking at the vulnerability aspect of the any particular pocket of land in the urban area, all the three options other than the hazard. Yes, if you look at developed land, developed site, it does not actually define as if if there is some kind of vulnerability in this particular site because of the activities happening within the site and also in the surroundings of the site. Again, public site, it is just defining as the ownership of the site. It is owned by the government, but that does not mean it could also have some kind of impact. It can be located on some kind of different terrain which is not suitable for construction or something like that. Even the forest area when it comes to the, again, it's untenability cannot be directly justified with respect to the forest areas, because forest areas are basically the ecologically sensitive areas. Urban forests and other areas which the natural with the natural vegetation are meant to be protected and conserved accordingly, but that does not mean these are hazardous areas. So untenable slums are usually the slums which are located on the hazardous sites. So if we remember the particular sessions which have happened this week as part of this week's session, so these hazardous slums, the untenable slums, the slums which are untenable, which are located usually on the hazardous sites, may be prone to the floods because of the close proximity to either a river or a canal, or maybe to some kind of health related, which is because of its close proximity to some kind of uh, waste disposal site, or maybe to close towards some kind of uh, un, un, unprotected area, unprotected or waste disposal sites. So these are the different untenable slums. Whenever we find the untenable slums, the major uh, operation which urban planners or housing aspects which they usually take is the resettlement and the rehabilitation. So they, as we discussed as we discussed in the this week sessions, it can be again offsite or the far side or the near side. So it can be both ways. But untenable slums, the in situ rehabilitation or the on-site redevelopment is not possible it, because it actually causes uh, the hazardous, the increases the vulnerability to the uh, particular aspect which it is vulnerable to again. So consider if there is one settlement which is falling within the floodline of one of the major river which is passing through the city, and if you want to redevelop it, the usual approach which we can follow is, because it is an untenable slum. So if you are going to redevelop it in the same location, you are not going to reduce the vulnerability of that particular site. So it will keeping the hazardous nature of that particular site in account, because it is lying in the floodplain, it is lying within the flood line of the particular river. Now what we have to do is, we have to shift this slum from this area to another area which is not in a hazardous zone, which does not fall in the floodline. For example, I'll just give a small example for this kind of context. So there are particularly different slums in the city of Vijayawada in Andhra Pradesh, and the river Krishna passes through the Vijayawada. So there are different slums which are abutting the Krishna river. Again, these slums actually get flooded during the heavy rains again. So whenever this kind of heavy rains happen, whenever there is flooding, these people have to be shifted to somewhere and they have to be evacuated. Some kind of safety shelter should be prepared and everything happens. So any no kind of redevelopment can actually happen in the same area if the slum is untenable. So whenever the slum is untenable, the immediate step the government or the authority responsible for the housing and urban planning should take is to rehabilitate and resettle the settlement. But in case if uh, again as we remember, there are two different ways we can do the uh, near site near site redevelopment, also the offset redevelopment. But for doing this one also we have to remember that, for example, livelihood will also play a key role in this context. Consider the fisherman housing is very close to the river body and it is falling in the flood lanes, but you should not take them too far away from the river that it will affect his livelihood in the ultimate turn. So it should be maintained in such a way, the livelihood should be maintained so that he can be in an accessible distance to the river, so that he can go for fishing and sell his fish and earn his livelihood. But also they also should make sure that he does not fall in the vulnerable zone or the hazardous zone of flooding for that particular river. So untenable slums are basically the slums which are located on the hazardous side, which are prone to some or other kind of activities which can make the life uncomfortable for the people in this kind of areas. So let us go to the third question again now. The third question is, which of the following is not a characteristic of urban villages? So there are four options again. So we'll look at each and every one again. Non-compliant with the prevailing development rules and regulations. So if we discuss the session, so how the way the urban villages form in, especially in Indian cities. So there is a mother city in the core city, and as the city is spreading outside, the these urban villages get surrounded by the high urban growth, urban development that is happening in the surroundings. So it usually consists of the existing narrow roads, and ultimately the latest development which comes is similar to the urban development. So the urban high dense development. So it is usually non-compliant with the prevailing development rules and regulations. That is the reason why urban villages are usually categorized as an informal housing category. So urban villages usually are non-compliant. They do not comply with the prevailing development rules and regulations, the control regulations which are provided by the development authority or the urban local body or the state town and country planning organizations respectively. And the second option is, as we discussed in the while discussing the non-compliance also, what usually happens is a village is surrounded by urban growth from the mother city. So there is high urban sprawl that is happening in the core city, and it has surrounded the surrounding rural pocket which is in the outskirts of the city. So ultimately this village will tend to behave like a semi-urban area. Sooner or later it will also behave like an urban area itself. So this is how the urban village is surrounded by an urban growth. So this is also the characteristic of urban village, but we are looking at not a characteristic. Occupying abandoned unoccupied space or building. So occupying abandoned space, consider if somebody is there, if some kind of site within the city is not occupied, so there is no building constructed, or maybe if there is a building also, so nobody is staying within this one. So in that case, if somebody some random person goes and stays in this particular building or this particular space, occupying abandoned or unoccupied space or building, it is not actually an urban village. It actually depends either both the characteristics depending upon the tenancy period, how long the people are staying in that particular space or building. So it means occupying the third option, occupying abandoned or unoccupied space or building, is actually giving an example of either slum or the squatters. So this is usually other type of informal housing typologies. So the third option is correct answer for this particular question. And again, let us anyway still also look at the fourth option again. The fourth option is change of occupation from agriculture to business. So urban villages, it is what it usually happens, because urban villages are always in the transition, because urban village, after getting surrounded by the high dense urban activity in the surroundings, which has spread, which has sprawled there because of the uh, immediately neighboring city, which has been spreading around the spreading overflowing the development across its boundaries and suddenly encompass the surrounding village. So this village will tend to act as an urban area. So people who were ideally has been involved in agriculture, we also usually either tend to shift to the different sectors of the economy. So either business, manufacturing, or industrial sector. So this is what usually that happens. So the correct answer for this particular question is again which of the following is not a characteristic of urban village. Non-compliant, because they do not actually comply with the prevailing development control regulations. So that is not the correct answer. And the village is surrounded by urban growth. This is actually a characteristic of urban village. The third option, actually it is defining the slum or squatter settlement, occupying some open land and unoccupied space or building. So it is the correct answer for this question. Again, the third option, as we remember, it depends against slums and squatter settlements. Whenever we want to improve the housing condition of this kind of slums, we look at the tenability, if it is tenable or not. If it is tenable, if it is located on a land that is suitable for development, it is okay, we can redevelop there, because even the government of India suggests that daily development should be as much as possible, it should be done in situ or in the same site. But if the land is not suitable for development, it is having some kind of hazardousness, maybe it is prone to some floods, maybe it is prone to some kind of health hazards because of the close proximity to some kind of uh, solid or liquid waste disposal. So in that case, it will be rehabilitated. So that is how that is what we have discussed in the previous question also. The correct answer for this one is, this is occupied, abandoned and unoccupied space or building is actually a characteristic of slum or squatter, and it's not a characteristic of urban village. So let us look at the question number 4 again, night shelters. So night shelters have been vividly discussed by Professor uh, as part of the homeless citizens who stay in the uh, different parts of the country. So there are 4 options. Now we have to select the option which is not representative of a night shelter. So the first one is the temporary shelter for the street dwellers. It is one of the property of night shelter. So night shelter, the people who are temporarily staying in particular city, either for the daily wage purpose or labor, construction labor, anybody. So if they are staying in a particular city and they go to night shelter for staying at night, and they immediately wake up in the morning and then go back to work again. So this night shelter has no other purpose other than to provide some kind of shelter for these people, homeless people at night time. They stay there, morning they wake up and they just leave. So this is just basically a temporary shelter for the street dweller. The first option is actually a feature of not feature of a night shelter. So, but we are looking at which is not a feature of night shelter. So let us look at the second option. Operational responsibilities are vested upon the NGO. So as it has been clearly discussed by professor. So usually this night shelter operation is given upon to the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, which are usually registered under the Societies Act, and they are having some kind of social responsibility which they want to dedicate to the people of the society. So the operation and maintenance of these kind of night shelters is usually under the undertaking of the non-governmental organization. So this is the correct. This is also a characteristic of night shelter. So this is not the correct answer. Basic services like water is provided and the dedicated shelters for senior citizens. Basic services like water is provided for the in the night shelter because it is very basic service. Again, without water, it is almost impossible to survive for any period of time. So, basic services like water and food. Sometimes even food is also provided, but basic services like water is minimal of something that should be a characteristics of night shelter. The fourth one is dedicated shelter for senior citizens. This is basically characteristics of uh, old age home. So, if you look at this particular option, the dedicated shelters for senior citizens or the people who are aged, who are not residing with their own family members, they are living and trying to stay together with somebody of different age. So that is basically the dedicated shelter for senior citizens, which is known as old age home. So if you look at it, first three options out of these ones, they're actually representative. They have a representative feature for the night shelter. But when you look at the fourth option, the option dedicated shelter for senior citizens is basically representing the old age homes. Again, there are also different types of dedicated shelters for senior citizens. The old age homes also, if we discuss, uh, if you remember the session by professor, there are three different types of old age homes again. The first one is where the independent, the old people that stay together without any much of dependence on anyone else. Second one is dependent, where they have some kind of codependency among themselves. Third one is assisted, where they seek help from some external factor using some kind of economic benefit to that particular assistant. So assisted old age. So there are three different types of old age homes also which are located. So as part of today's session, we discussed these four questions only. But however, apart from these sessions, now we can have some kind of further reading for the urban villages. Again, this is the first one is uh, the one of the reports prepared by World Resources Institute in for a uh, case study for the urban villages and how the urban villages behave in Indian context. So it was prepared in 2020 by WRA, and then there is another presentation for the same thing. There is also a detailed session which has been conducted by WRA. On there is also a YouTube video. I am providing the link on the screen. I will also share it with you in a Google Drive format, which is available with you through the NPTEL portal also. So this can be the further reading which can help you to understand the urban villages in a much comprehensive manner, how they grow, how they are surrounded, and what are the impacts of surrounding development on the urban villages. So if you look at it, there are different characteristics of urban villages. So this report, the particular report discusses certain concepts again. If we can compare these notes with what we have learned with respect to the urban villages from the theoretical perspective as discussed by Professor in this week 7 sessions. So the first one is the change in livelihood. As we discussed in earlier one of the options, we discussed that there is a change in livelihood in the urban villages from the traditional animal husbandry and agricultural associated primary activities to the secondary and tertiary activities which are comprised predominantly of the manufacturing or service and business kind of sector. So the change in livelihood happens in the urban villages. The report prepared by the WRA, it identifies this. This is one of the cases in the National Capital Territory of Delhi, and the second one is these urban villages uh, are exploding into the dense mixed land use settlements. So, if you look at a traditional village and an urban village, so the village in a conventional sense is having either high level of the agricultural activity, high levels of agricultural land, large amounts of open space is available. But when you come to the urban villages, as a city, this village is surrounded with the immediate urban development, and the urban area also demands a lot of land. Slowly this village is transforming into the urban area. So this actually gives rise to the dense mixed use settlements. If you look at a traditional village which is not surrounded by any kind of urban development, it usually has predominantly low dense residential settlements. But an urban village, how it is different from a residential normal rural village? It is because it is in the case that rural areas, if not surrounded by the urban areas, usually have low dense residential settlements, and very limited amount of mixed use usually happens in rural areas. But when it is an urban village, it usually has dense mixed use characteristics. And another major observation which we have discussed, which the authors have observed in Delhi, is that there is poor physical and social infrastructure. Physical infrastructure, again, water supply, sanitation, even road connectivity, electricity, uh, storm water management, solid waste management, all of these facilities are not properly organized in urban villages. As we remember, the proper planned settlement, the way planned the formal urban areas come up, urban villages, because they are informal, there is very limited amount of land available for providing the services, physical infrastructure services. There is a difficulty in providing the physical infrastructure services for the urban local body. There is poor physical infrastructure. And coming to social infrastructure, so if you look at the typical characteristics of these urban villages, uh, there might be not enough number of schools, the social infrastructure, the educational facilities can be limited. Maybe as if you remember the previous week's problem solving session, we have discussed the URDP-FI guidelines, where we said like URDP-FI guidelines is there should be a primary school for 5,000 people or 7,500. So there is kind of some kind of standard for based on the population. But these are dense mixed use settlements. Land availability is very minimal. So provision of social infrastructure, that is adequate education facilities, is a very big task, very difficult task in the urban villages. So it is one of the reason why there is poor social infrastructure in these urban villages. Similarly, if you look at the health facilities, primary health centers, hospitals, it is also difficult to provide them in these urban villages. Again, for the same reason of the limited land availability. Another example is the parks and recreational facilities, the local parks, neighborhood parks, housing area parks. So because there are dense mixed use settlements and very high population density, there is very limited amount of space available. Even the roads will be narrower in this, usually in these areas. So the urban villages have poor physical and social infrastructure. Then let us look at the fourth one, that is self-built incremental housing. So people either they usually develop these houses in phases. First, they develop some part of the area either horizontally or vertically. Maybe increasing the floors over a period of time is one of the options, or increasing the space utilization of the plot space also is one of the options. So, incremental housing is typically identified in these urban villages. Further, often supplying low cost rental housing. So, if you look at this kind of mechanism, it is usually observed in almost all the cities of the country. So, uh, it is directly linked to the previous characteristics of urban village again. So, first of all, somebody who is residing in urban village, maybe maybe a dweller of that urban village since the period when it was actually been a conventional village. Uh, he might be residing in this particular area. He might had one floor of area, and later on he developed some one or two extra floors, and they supply the low cost rental housing. So there is one of the advantages we can look at it, but it is also having some kind of vulnerability, some kind of other factors of informality. That is the reason why. But if we observe carefully, it actually supplies low cost rental housing in the urban areas. These urban villages usually provide the low cost rental housing. And finally, the last point is proximity to ecologically sensitive zones and the proximity to ecologically sensitive zones and archaeologically significant structures. So, what usually we have observed for the urban villages in the Delhi area is like these urban villages are located in a close proximity to ecological sensitive zones. Maybe some kind of wetlands, maybe some kind of the natural vegetation dense areas, or maybe some kind of protective areas which have some kind of ecological value, or they are also close to the archaeologically significant features, which can be the tombs or other anciently built structures. So these are typical characteristics which I have observed for the urban villages in Delhi. So for this context, I just if you look at the previous image, this has been taken from the report of the WRA in 2020. I have randomly selected one of the uh, urban village in this list and Googled it. I have searched it on the Google Maps and how it is located and how these features actually represent with respect to this one. So the name of this urban village located in National Capital Territory of Delhi is Kotla Mubarakpur. So if you look at this, this is located in this particular area. So it is high dense. If you look at it, it is very high dense and very almost no land available, no land is available for the further development. So, and if you remember the previous point which we have discussed, so it says like it is located in close proximity to the archaeological site or ecologically sensitive sites. You can look at the high level of greenery on the west side of this neighborhood, and further there is one of the Daria Khan's tomb, which is one of the archaeologically important category. So, this is how we can understand that these characteristics are actually represented in these urban villages of the Delhi. So, this is an interesting case study by WRA. I will provide you with the document, this particular report after the study, and anyone who is interested can look at this in order to have a comprehensive understanding about how urban villages are developing in Indian context. So this is the particular report. It is prepared by WRA India, World Resources Institute, and then it's titled "Preventing Urban Villages from Transitioning into Slums." So the thing is, if you look at the previous characteristics, it says high dense settlement already, and there is some kind of issue with respect to the land ownership and other things. So if not properly taken care of, these urban villages are vulnerable to fall into the category of slums. They are slowly transitioning from urban villages to slums. So this particular organization, the WRA, they try to provide a development plan framework, how to prepare a development plan, how to let these urban villages develop. There is some kind of context specific and how to redevelop these urban villages so that they don't behave like slums in the future. So this is the major focus of this one. They wanted to develop a methodology to prepare the development plans for these urban villages. This was published in December 2020. So let us look at how these transitions happen in this one. So there are four different categories. If you look at this, I have taken this from the same report again. So there are four different things. What are the four different transitions which are happening in these urban villages? Because it is surrounded by the high dense urban activity. So if we remember the example of the Kotla Mubarakpur, the one on which we have just looked at. So there is some kind of transition is happening as it's urban village. It is transitioning from village to urban village and slowly it becomes a part of an urban area. The first change which we are discussing is the livelihood pattern, how the livelihood of the people is changing, the nature of the socio-economic activity. What are the different activities that used to happen when it was in a rural context, and the way it transformed into an urban village, what are the changes that are happening as it is transitioning and after becoming urban village, and how the settlement built up is changing. The second one, if you look at it, settlement built up options, how it is changing again. The the densities, population densities, and the land uses, how they are changing. That is also discussed. How it is transitioning from rural to urban areas. The third one is infrastructure levels, connectivity to the city centers. How they are connected by a road network to the actual city, the core city, which is actually causing it to transition from rural area to an urban village. And finally, community dynamics, how the community is behaving with respect to these transitions over a period of time. So let us look at the first one, livelihood patterns, how it is changing. So initially it used to be an agricultural farming and animal husbandry related sectors. But you can find there is a transition as it turns from the traditional rural area to urban village. The secondary and tertiary sectors. What are the secondary and tertiary sectors? Secondary and tertiary sectors include the manufacturing end. Secondary includes the manufacturing sectors. Tertiary includes the tertiary includes the service sectors, which include the banking uh, and other similar service sectors. So these are the main transitions. Earlier it used to be, when it was in rural area, it used to be agriculture and animal husbandry sector oriented society. So it has some kind of transition. People have stopped practicing agriculture and land animal husbandry. Now they are shifting towards, slowly shifting towards not slowly, it usually happens very rapidly also. It can happen in a period of months to years also. So that there will be change from traditional animal husbandry and agricultural farming to manufacturing and service sectors, and how the settlement built up areas are changing from the rural to urban areas, and how they are transitioning. So earlier, during a period of the mostly it is animal sheds. Whenever there is some kind of household within the rural area, even if you go to the traditional rural areas which are remote to the cities, if you go there, there will be a house with some kind of facility, some kind of open space dedicated for the animal husbandry practices, either to tie and keep the cattle there, or some kind of activity, some kind of animal husbandry and home-based cottage industries, maybe preparing some kind of activities. Even some kind of urban villages also retain these kind of cottage industries, but it is not usually observed in this case. So home-based cottage industries, this can stand up to many other small micro-scale enterprises, which include maybe like BD making, some kind of industries, usually in terms of self-help groups. And it usually, before transitioning into an urban area, it has a low to moderate settlement density. The settlement density is very low because it is surrounded by the high open space, high levels of open space. It can be the agricultural land, it can be the natural vegetation or anything. But the transition happens when it is surrounded by the urban areas. So mixed land use starts to appear, and it usually has the residential and commercial purposes. So residential and commercial purposes usually get mixed up. It can be mixed up in any way again. So ground floor is usually meant for commercial and above floors are usually meant for residential, or it can be any kind of different types of mix. So mixed land use happens when a rural area is transforming itself from a traditional village to urban village. So as it develops into the more urban areas, more into an urban village, there is high incidence of mixed use built form. It usually comprises of commercial and residential areas, and there is a high tendency of unfollowing of the development control regulations. So it is discussing the same thing. So leading to the absence of setbacks and the open spaces. So these are congested areas, uh, the dense, very high dense because it is actually accommodating the urban population within the village area. So the traditional development control regulations often neglected in this kind of urban villages. So this is how the settlement built up is actually changing from the low dense residential area with some kind of agricultural and animal husbandry activities to mixed commercial and residential area with uh, no proper adherence towards the development control regulations. The third feature is infrastructure levels and the connectivity to the city centers. The low level of services, the physical infrastructure and social infrastructure services, they have very low level. There are not adequate number of schools and health facilities for the people residing in these rural areas, traditionally rural areas. It may have low transit. It might not be properly connected to the city, nearest city, which is actually causing it to transition from the rural to urban areas. As it is in the transition, some kind of increased public investment will come into it, because the village is connected to a city core through some kind of improved road network. Not, not it could not be a very well established road, but still it is a fair improvement over what it was existing when it was a rural area. As it develops, it happens during a transition. As it expands into an urban village, as it transforms itself into an urban village, there will be poor levels of service infrastructure with respect to population density. So no matter how much investment will come from the public sector, still there is some kind of poor level of infrastructure because the population density is, these urban villages have so high population density. So even after the increased amount of public investment to improve the infrastructure, still it was not sufficient because these areas are so densely populated. And this can usually have low to moderate level of transit access because of increased population density. It can also have some traffic congestion and other practices. So this is how the infrastructure levels and connectivity happens. This transition happens in the more rural to urban areas. And finally, the community dynamics, how the community behaves. Again, earlier when it was rural area, it is under the control of the local village panchayat or the gram panchayat, and the local societies, the local groups, the social groups, caste groups, and the community people, they used to have strong influence. But as it has some kind of transition from rural to urban nature, so the influence gets reduced. The influence of the local panchayat or the local groups will reduce. It will decrease to a minimal level, and as it becomes the urban area, so urban village, there is the strong influence will be of the local representative. If it falls into one of the wards of that particular city, the ward representative, the land brokers, the real estate agents, the people who are basically the stakeholders of land, are having some kind of relevance with respect to the typologies that uh, the urban village, in the urban village. So there is different dynamics that are happening in these urban villages as as there is some transition. Livelihood, if you look at livelihood, there is shift from agricultural and animal husbandry to the manufacturing service sectors. Settlement built up earlier when it was a rural area, there was low density residential land use. Now it can be the urban village will have high density mixed land use. Again, if you remember, these high density mixed land use might also have uh, very limited adherence to the uh, actual development control regulations. It can also cause the haphazard development. Further, coming to the infrastructure levels and connectivity, urban local bodies and the public investments will try to improve the physical and social infrastructure, but it could not meet the desired levels because the population density increases in the much higher level than the public investments come into the place. And finally, the community dynamics, the people, the local influence. Earlier, it used to be somebody who has some kind of local panchayat or maybe some kind of social self-help group or something. But the power transitions, when it becomes an urban village from a rural village, uh, urban village, it has the people who own the land, who have the who have some kind of impact with respect to the land. So these include the land brokers, the real estate agents, and the local representatives. These people will have more power than the traditional caste societies, social groups, and communities. So this is how this kind of transitions usually happen. So this is actually it for today's session, and if you have any doubt, we will discuss it either through your in call messages, or we can also you can also unmute yourself and ask the question. If anybody has joined later on, if you want me to go through the whole presentation, just let me know once again. We'll just summarize it as quickly as possible. Okay, I hope that everything is clear to everybody. Still, I hope a few of you might have missed the initial few slides. I'll just rush through all the slides for next 5 minutes. Then, if you have any doubt, just please post in the in-call messages, or you can unmute yourself and ask me anytime. So, okay, let us just revise whatever we have discussed today. Uh, so initially we discussed what are the different types of informal housing typologies. This one is employer housing is basically a formal housing typologies, Jhuggi Jhopdi, refugee settlements, urban villages. These are basically the informal housing typologies. The second question, it was untenable slums. Untenable slums are usually the terms which have some kind of vulnerability towards some surrounding or uh, inside characteristics of the particular land on which the settlement is located. So untenable slums are usually the slums which are hazardous, which are located on the hazardous sites. It can be the floodplains. It can be in the very close proximity to the solid waste disposal site, which can further lead to uh, uh, some kind of communicable diseases. So these are untenable slums, and untenable slums usually require uh, resettlement and rehabilitation, which from in a different site other than its actual location. The third question is, which of the following is not a characteristic of urban village? We understood that they don't comply. Urban villages don't comply with the prevailing development control regulation. We also observed it from the case study which we have studied by the WRI. Then the village is surrounded by the urban growth. It is urban villages are surrounded by urban growth. Urban villages do not occupy the space or unoccupied space or building. It is usually a characteristic of slum or squatter settlement. So that is the correct answer. And the fourth option is change of occupation from agriculture to business. As we discussed in the next slides also, urban villages usually have the change in occupation from agriculture to the service sector or the manufacturing sector. The fourth question, which of the following is not a feature of the night shelters? Night shelters are usually uh, used as temporary shelter for the street dwellers, and they have the operational responsibilities which have been given to the non-governmental organizations to undertake this. And basic services like water are provided by the night shelters, but these dedicated shelters are not meant for the senior citizens. The dedicated shelters which are meant for the senior citizens are known as old age homes. And there was a further reading which is suggested for this one to understand the urban villages and have a comprehensive understanding of the same. Urban villages in Delhi, the study identifies there is some kind of change in livelihood. These are usually the dense mixed-use settlements with commercial and residential mix. But these settlements urban villages usually have low levels of physical and social infrastructure, and they have some kind of the housing development that happening over a period of time in the phases, and low cost. It usually supplies the low cost rental housing, and finally, it is in the close proximity, usually in a close proximity to the ecologically sensitive zone or archaeologically significant structures, which might be the tombs, statues, or some other figures. So we have seen how one of the urban village in National Capital Territory, New Delhi. So this is Kotla Mubarak is surrounded by one of the archaeological site and also high levels of green space and surroundings. So this is basically a report prepared by the WRI India. Uh, this report actually discusses the how urban village development plan frameworks can be developed in order to prevent the urban villages from transforming themselves into the slums. And finally, we also discussed there are some kind of changes which are happening, transition that is happening in the urban villages. Livelihood is changing from usually the agriculture and animal husbandry to the manufacturing and service sectors, and there is shift from the low density residential land use to the high density mixed land use. And the urban local bodies try to improve the social and physical infrastructure facilities. They try to improve the road conditions. They try to improve the water supply. They try to improve the solid waste and sewage management. But uh, still, the population grows at such a high rate, and the density is so high. The population density requirements usually are not met by the huge investments made by the urban local bodies in order to address the social and physical infrastructure services in the urban villages. And finally, in urban villages, the people who are having some kind of accountability with respect to the land management, the land brokers, local real estate agents, and the local representatives, they usually have some kind of uh, influence in the urban villages. So uh, that's from my side today. And if you have any kinds of questions and any doubts, just let me know. We can discuss it in as detail as possible. Okay. I'll still wait for a couple of minutes. If there is any question, you can either ask me to call message. You can also ask me by unmuting yourself. I'll wait a couple of minutes here. If you have any doubts, just let me know. Okay, in that case, I assume that everything is clear to everybody, and hope. And we have one more week sessions left again. One next week we'll have another problem solving session. I try my level best to invite Professor Roy to the next week's problem solving session. I hope there will be a very good amount of attendance for the next week, and I also wish you all the best for the upcoming exam also. Thank you very much for joining. Uh, Still, any questions? Just let me know. Thank you. Bye. Okay, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, let's conclude the meeting in that case. Thank you very much.